In the corridors of the Vatican, they had given him the nickname the Pinky as a joke. In the 80s, they had nicknamed him the Panzer Cardinal, basically the armored cardinal. But it wasn't because our protagonist today had a past. Maybe in his youth in the armored troops, even though that forced membership in the Hitler Youth, then the service in the anti-aircraft defense and a recruit battalion in Bavaria weighed on his record. Of course, it would later be said that in reality the young Joseph Ratzinger had been forced to serve in the troops of Nazi Germany. Someone insinuated the possibility that Ratzinger could desert, as in fact at a certain point he seemed to do. But stains tend to remain, even more so, if the people in question develop a complex personality and an even more intricate and difficult personal story to analyze, opening themselves up to criticism which can be fair, exaggerated, or unfair. Simply put, Joseph Ratzinger had a reputation for being uncompromising within the church hierarchy, a man of principle, not willing to give in even a millimeter, neither on purely matters of faith, much less on organizational issues and mere power balance beneath St. Peter's dome. You could say that Joseph Ratzinger wasn't exactly an easy person to deal with, but you have to acknowledge one merit. He was undoubtedly a theologian, a very well-prepared theologian, perhaps one of the best within the German school. And it was precisely this great intelligence, this subtlety, and his enormous vast cultural background, obviously within matters of faith and dogmatics. These were the reasons why Cardinal Frings wanted him with him at the Second Vatican Council, that council which had been convened by Pope Roncalli, John 23, but was later concluded by Paul VI, to give the church liturgy a refresh, to adapt it to the current times. They realized in the Vatican that the liturgical celebration was not only being diminished, but was moving further and further away from a society that was advancing not at double speed, but at 4 times the speed. Compared to the adaptation of the Vatican itself, well, it was decided to update to try to keep up with the times. Frings wanted the young Ratzinger by his side as an expert, as a collaborator. Ratzinger skillfully seized that showcase, a truly far-reaching opportunity. In a short time, within a few months, he built a reputation as a respected advisor. This reputation was further strengthened during the council, because other cardinals also got to know him and appreciate him for, as we said, his vast and immense cultural background regarding the Catholic religion. In the Roman Curia, Ratzinger began to make many friends, including Montini. The future Pope Paul VI, the Pope who, sometime later after the Second Vatican Council, would grant him the cardinal's red hat. Of course, becoming a cardinal can be seen within the ecclesiastical hierarchy as the ultimate achievement. How many high-ranking prelates would have given anything to obtain that position? We've already come across one in our stories, Paul Casimir Marsychus. He did everything to get the news Cardinal Domina, but he didn't succeed. Ratzinger didn't need schemes or truly complicated matters to obtain that position. Absolutely. It was enough for him to show his loyalty to the Holy Mother Church and his ability to understand the needs of the Church, and especially of its fathers, as far as the requirements of the liturgy were concerned. His rise became unstoppable. Ratzinger's ascent was irresistible. Not so much with Montini, and even less with a pope who was definitely at the opposite end, like Albino Luciani, John Paul II, but with Karol Wojtyla. Maybe Wojtyla saw in Ratzinger a bulwark, a sort of bastion of intransigence, but also of absolute iron will to preserve tradition. And for this reason, he entrusted him with what was once called the Holy Office. The Holy Office does not have a good reputation historically. It used to be. Simply put, the Holy Inquisition. It was that organization spread throughout Europe, meant to find, pursue, and condemn heretics, or anyone judged as an enemy or potential enemy of the Roman Church. He knew something about it. A Tuscan who lived in the 18th century. His name was Tommaso Crudeli. Tommaso Crudeli was accused of heresy and apostasy for being one of the first Italian Freemasons. Tommaso, his martyrdom. He was arrested, imprisoned, interrogated, tortured, and finally locked up. He made the Grand Duchy of Tuscany the first pre-unification state, not only to abolish the institution of the Holy Office, but even to order the demolition of the building used by the Holy Office in Florence, unleashing a wave throughout pre-unification Italy and also in the rest of Europe, rejecting what was an unwelcome and often imposing presence by the Roman Curia. The fact is that the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, this new name taken by the Holy Office, had remained, from the time of Tommaso Crudeli onward, perhaps the most feared of all the Vatican departments. And it was right there that Ratzinger earned the nickname Panzer Cardinal for his ability to overcome any obstacle, like an armored vehicle with tracks that goes over everything and everyone. There, Ratzinger was able to show off what was his firepower, not because he was an expert artilleryman. Absolutely, we're speaking metaphorically. His power was due to his diplomatic weight, to his dense network of friends and collaborators within the Curia, but also outside among the various apostolic nunciatures around the world. We also think that at a certain point it was Ratzinger himself who intervened heavily on a topic we just touched on, that of Freemasonry. At the end of the 1970s, at the beginning of the 1980s, it appeared not only in different parts of Europe, but also in Rome. A sort of attempt at reconciliation, at bringing closer together an organization as deeply dogmatic as the Catholic Church, and one that is absolutely non-dogmatic, like Freemasonry. There are also other prelates, some of them even German, who are pushing to find common ground, to put an end to over 250 years of hostility. Well, Ratzinger, precisely in his role as head of the former Holy Office of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, issues a document that not only disavows the German bishops who had promoted this kind of dialogue, but even the doctrine of two previous popes, John 23 and Paul 6, both of whom had shown a slight willingness, a mild openness toward the Freemasons, not only the Italian ones. This kind of cold shower was something never seen before. It almost seemed as if Ratzinger was acting not only with the approval of the Pope, that is Wojtyla, but even with the explicit approval of all the major electors who had brought Wojtyla to the throne of Peter. Another letter, the De Delictis Gravioribus, had instead become a sort of handbook for silence, for bishops involved in cases concerning pedophilia. Yes, because the 80s became the years of major scandals for the Vatican. First, the Oran-Brociano affair, then pedophilia. Cases of complaints start to appear around the world, complaints from families or children, reports of abuse and violence. These complaints are coming in from all over the globe. And these are very, very, very serious complaints. At a certain point, these complaints even reach the Holy Father, the Pontiff, the Holy See. In the face of all those complaints, he refuses to cooperate. He claims to have a special privilege to be essentially a religious congregation, but at the same time also a foreign state. In short, it establishes the dual nature, that of ministers of worship, as well as members of a sovereign state, autonomous and with its own rules. In relation to the magistrates of various states who investigate and accuse different prelates, well, that document, endorsed by Ratzinger himself, causes a small diplomatic earthquake. Yes, because people start to wonder if the Pope, as well as his Secretary of State and the other members of the so-called Vatican government, should actually be seen as political figures. To himself, Stanley. All this leads to a sort of rift with the United States Department of State, because it is the United States that is the entity most committed to investigating crimes of pedophilia. That rift will only be healed after some time, with the recognition of the diplomatic unit in favor of the reigning pontiff, in his capacity as head of state. Another small masterpiece by Joseph Ratzinger, and yet, despite his determination, his absolute unwavering faith in the laws of the Roman Church, not many were betting on Ratzinger as the successor to John Paul II. All this despite the fact that John Paul II himself went through a personal martyrdom that lasted about 5 years. From the onset of his first major health problems to a very long ordeal, it was marked by media exposure, or rather overexposure, culminating in his death, which was followed practically worldwide, watched by the faithful and others. When the consistory of cardinals gathers in the Sistine Chapel to elect the new successor to the throne of Peter, well, Ratzinger's name isn't highly favored even by the bookmakers. Do you think there might be other candidates? After all, Coelho was the first non-Italian pope in almost half a century, and the second consecutive non-Italian pope. He wasn't viewed favorably, at least according to the analyses of Vatican experts at the time. And yet, analyses can be wrong, and yet the election of Joseph Ratzinger to the papacy was not exactly a surprise, at least for those who were familiar with Wojtyla's Pontificate. By the way, regarding the dark sides of that pontificate, I refer you to the video available on this channel. Ratzinger presented himself as a continuer of Wojtyla, even in a stricter sense, in a more traditionalist, more anti-progressive way. Wojtyla is remembered today as a good pope, a pope of smiles, a pope of dialogue. In reality, he was a much more traditionalist and conservative pope than one might have thought. He was elected in perfect contrast to the message of his immediate predecessor, the unfortunate Albino Luciani. With Wojtyla, the Catholic Church had decided to restore, to go back, to be stricter, more uncompromising. And with Ratzinger, this intransigence found a new champion and a new voice, as well as a new voice, the reign of Benedict XVI. This chosen name, a name that reached far back in time, almost a century. It would have been difficult regardless, with many chances to stumble. Not only pedophilia, a plague that returns cyclically and affects several pontificates in cycles. But let's think about the scandal of the Legionaries of Christ with the abuses inside the sect, or about Ireland, where abuses committed inside religious institutions are coming to light. Then there's that Lectio Magistralis in Regensburg, which is a special place for Ratzinger, and not only for him. It's the university where the beating heart of German theology resides. And during that Lectio Magistralis, Ratzinger slipped on the classic banana peel, an ill-advised statement, a historical quote that had infuriated the Islamic world. While in previous years there had been efforts to seek a peaceful confrontation, not to mention a dialogue with other religions, Ratzinger's pontificate was marked and characterized by these slip-ups, moments of friction, misunderstandings, and diplomatic incidents. Another incident, for example, was the pardon granted to the Lefebvrist schismatics, the followers of Monsignor Lefebvre, those 4 bishops who had been excommunicated because they were considered heretics and were pardoned by Ratzinger, starting with the English Bishop Williamson, an openly anti-Semitic bishop who causes scandal every time he makes a statement. Then there is another case, one that already started with Wojtyla, the fight against acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, especially in Africa, where unfortunately the plague of acquired immunodeficiency syndrome is difficult to contain, and where the World Health Organization recommends the use of condoms, of contraceptives, not just in words, to try to contain the spread of what is essentially a pandemic. Well, even in this case, Ratzinger proves to be a pontiff who is not in step with the times but remains anchored to tradition, almost untouchable by the outside world. It's as if current issues don't affect the pontiff. He continues to repeat the pure and simple doctrine. However, it's a doctrine that proves to be out of step with the times. It's a problem. The pontificate of Ratzinger's God is a constant problem, and it's a problem that also emerges within the Roman Curia, where many factions are at play. Some support him, some criticize him, and others find him unbelievable but real, too moderate, strange to say and even to hear, yet that's how it is. Years later, some of his close collaborators would reveal this, starting with Father Georg Genswein, his personal secretary, who was much talked about because he was very powerful, but also very close to the pontiff. For a long time, there would be various rumors about their relationship. The fact is that Ratzinger, starting from 2012 onward, faced increasing pressure, which became harder and harder to resist. Pressure coming from those who wanted to keep the scandals of pedophilia under wraps, from those who wanted a tougher stance against the secular world, from those who basically wanted to restore the ancient papacy. Ratzinger, overwhelmed by these pressures, by this responsibility that isn't for him, that he doesn't recognize, considering himself simply a guardian of theology, Ratzinger ultimately decides to resign. He does so on February 11, 2013, a historic date. It had been almost 6 centuries since the last resignation of a pope. At that time, it was Gregory XII. Those resignations, those of Ratzinger, carry a political message. They are the result of a very difficult decision and the outcome of long reflection. The reasons, as we said, are different. Ratzinger, tired of the many tensions within the Vatican walls, subjected to excessive pressure that he can no longer withstand, perhaps even blackmailed over issues concerning the management of the church's assets or his relationship with Father Georgiver. What is certain, however, is that his resignation would have opened a completely new phase in the Catholic Church. The election of Bergoglio later called Pope Francis a brand new name, never used before. Initially, it seemed to be the message of continuity. In short, a Jesuit taken from Argentina, who was also talked about as a spectator who stood by with his hands, with his arms, silent during the general's dictatorship. And yet that Jesuit will change a lot. He will change, for some, even too much. Ratzinger, now Pope Emeritus, lives in a Vatican monastery, no longer leaves, makes no statements, and lets his successor lead. But there are many followers of Ratzinger, especially inside the Vatican, who do not approve. They remain silent for a long time, and occasionally someone sends out cryptic messages. There will be other scandals, but in the end, we will have to wait for the death of Ratzinger on December 31, 2022, so that all those secrets, all those unspoken words, those half-finished sentences may find some sort of fulfillment. All of this is made explicit by him, by Georg Genswein, who after years of silence speaks to the media. And he declares himself disappointed by Francesco Thuri, disappointed by what was supposed to be a choice of continuity, but instead turned out to be a break, disappointed by a Vatican policy that is anything but traditionalist. It is Genswein himself who says that Ratzinger was also disappointed and embittered by what turned out to be a choice that went against the trend of his pontificate. He couldn't change it now. Those words from Father Georg Genswein had already cost him dearly. It is recent news that Pope Francis has decided to send him back to Germany, removing his last assignments within the Vatican. A vendetta or just the end of a long chapter, perhaps too long, marked by misunderstandings and gossip. What we know about the Vatican is that under that great dome, inside those walls, interests, ideas, and political positions are at play. There are positions and factions at play that would like to influence things, not just internal politics. The Vatican's small size makes its internal politics less important. What really matters are its global political choices. Through the pressure exerted on countries with a Catholic majority, starting with Italy. Let's also consider France, Spain, Portugal, Ireland, the United States, and all of South America, where Catholic communities are strong. When is the new heir of St. Peter elected? It's not just the faithful who look to tomorrow with hope and a bit of fear. It's also the rulers who need to understand who they'll have to deal with, who they'll have to measure themselves against. When Ratzinger was elected, many rulers realized it wouldn't be easy. They would be dealing with a former Panzer Cardinal, destined to become, excuse the play on words, a Panzer Extirpator. that is, an armored Holy Father. With his resignation, much changed in the church, and with his passing, the floodgates have opened. It seems that the final clash has begun between the two souls of the church, the one more open to the weak, embodied by Francesco, and the one more clinging to tradition. It is a clash that will probably see a new chapter at the next conclave, when the successor to the current pontiff will have to be elected, and who knows which pope will emerge. Prophecies say Francesco is the pope who will either change or destroy the church, depending on interpretation. After him, who will there be? Will there be another Francesco or another Benedetto? In relation to Ratzinger, we just have to wait and see.